All right, Republicans don't think that they have a sexual harassment problem, that they also think that Democrats do. There is a new poll out, a survey from HuffPost and YouGov. It finds that 76% of Republicans and Republican leaners think Democrats have a very or somewhat serious problem with sexual harassment, but just 40% of Republicans think that sexual harassment is a very or somewhat serious problem for their own party, while a slightly higher percentage, 43% of Republicans, thinks it is not an issue with their own party. A majority of Democrats, 60%, think their own party has a sexual harassment problem, while 75% of Democrats think sexual harassment is a very or somewhat serious problem with the GOP. What does this mean?
Well, I mean, this poll was really interesting, actually, if you look through it, because, I mean, you look at those top line numbers that you read, and it obviously seems to indicate that there's a sort of a lot of hypocrisy within the Republican base and not as much with the Democrat base. But if you look into the brass tacks, look through the numbers, there's some interesting figures. It said that in that same poll, it said that, for example, 77% of Democrats still support Bill Clinton, despite the fact that 68% of them believe that he probably or definitely committed sexual assault.
What does that mean to you?
That means that it's politics is all tribal these days. It's like it's all tribalism. There's very little principle. Like no one stands on anything. They just kind of like, we've sort of self-sorted within different camps, and we kind of just support whatever camp we're in. And
I think that's, while true, simplistic, because I don't think, nor do I think he should, that Bill Clinton could survive that now. So it is a little different to look back.
Well, Al Franken's surviving it, right?
Well, Al Franken has survived, but again,
and John Conyers.
Let's not pretend that what Bill Clinton was accused of is any way similar to what Al Franken's been accused of.
Obviously not.
They're in different galaxies, and we don't know if Al Franken's going to survive it. I bet he doesn't. I bet he quits, but I don't know. We'll find out. But it is more difficult in human nature to go back and assign blame after the fact. Bill Clinton gets accused of what he was accused of now. I don't think he would survive it. Although it is worth pointing out that unlike every other charge against both people on the right and the left, that was funded, which did draw into question legitimately, it felt at the time, the veracity of some of the accusers. But I still don't think that he would survive it now.
You think he speaks to the DNC in 2020? I mean,
yes,
I think he probably does.
I think he probably does. I think as a former president, it probably trumps that. It would be bold to deny him, and there's another living president. There's two, in fact. I mean, hopefully Jimmy Carter will still be around in 2020, but you don't.
He's going to bring the house down,
Jimmy Carter.
So that would be interesting, because that's a different, and you can obviously have his, Hillary could speak as well. I just think that definitely factors into it. But as you know, a number of Democrats, at least publicly, have come out, written about, and spoken that they would reevaluate what Bill Clinton was accused of in light of the current climate and in light of how we now treat sexual harassment claims.
And the ones who came out strongest are running for president.
Yeah.
So this is when you talk about polls, this is a complicated question to learn something from. Because I think when there's the psychology of taking a poll where everyone's got their guns up. They know, and it's like, this is my chance to communicate something about myself and about someone's going to learn about the country from this, and I'm one of the 300 or 1,200 people that they're asking. And it's more simple to ask, who are you voting for? And we can learn from that. What we can do is try to find like controls and things to balance against each other. And in this one, they asked the same question to Democrats and Republicans. And it seems like the Democrats are more self-aware of a problem and more likely to admit that there is something wrong.
I guess my point is that in general, they admit that there's a problem, but when it comes to like individuals, because the poll also showed that they still support Al Franken, even though they disagree with what he did and stuff. Like it's just like when it becomes different. It's like whenever.
Are you going to do something about it? Kind of thing.
Whenever there's a poll about like a candidate running against a generic Republican or like that, the generic person always wins because you can't.
You're not running against him. That is one thing that is all the Bernie supporters, and I was a Bernie supporter as well, here never quite got. Like there was never a campaign run against Bernie Sanders. The campaign would have been effective. He might have won. We'll never know. But there would have been a campaign against him instead of the campaign against Hillary. And then there would have been very specific things said about Bernie that kept it. That's none of that landed because there was no campaign. Always when you say perfect, it's essentially like saying you want this corrupt person or a perfect candidate
right.
to run against.
You're projecting all kinds
you're projecting all the best things about it.
Yeah, and the difference between those two things, it is like saying, poll 1, do you want 1,000 pounds of candy? Yes. Poll 2, do you want a stomach ache? No. Okay, there you go.
You know, like it's easier to say like, the Democrats have a sexual harassment problem, but then when you start to break, like, okay, what about this person? What about that person?
I object to the nature of the question. It's interesting, and I don't mean it shouldn't even be asked, but then. Like the notion that a sexual harassment problem would exist inside of a political party is of no more value than saying, do coffee drinkers have a sexual harassment problem?
Sure.
Of course they do. Men have a sexual harassment problem. A few women, but overwhelmingly men have a sexual harassment problem. And I imagine half of them are Democrats. Half of them are, many of them are independents. There's some libertarians also. That does not mark whether you have a sexual harassment problem or not. That only tells you that there may be some, that you may be able to use the hypocrisy argument more aggressively against one party rather than the other. But hypocrisy arguments
almost never work.
And also,
you're right. I did say something different last time.
I'm not interested in hypocrisy. Like I don't really. I mean, there's very rarely there's an argument about. First of all, I think hypocrisy tends to make people interesting. Right? Now, it depends on what the hypocrisy is. If your hypocrisy is gay people are sinners and they should go to hell or prison, and then it turns out you're gay, well, that's an interesting hypocrisy that I think we should point out. If your hypocrisy is, I said this then and now I've largely changed my mind, or I didn't realize I'd be in this situation, sorry. I'm not interested, that doesn't matter. I care about, for politicians, what have you done, what are you going to do? Not so much do we catch you in a little moment of hypocrisy.
I think it's the most important thing when you're looking at politicians is even beyond the individual is just like which power sectors in the society do they owe power to?
That's right.
And that always ends up being what they end up doing in office.
That's right.
Anyway.
And a point that this is an argument I have with Cenk a lot, like, or at least a thing that I focus on, and maybe overly, but like in addition to who do they owe allegiance to, right? Who do they owe power to? And then who is sitting at their table, like who gets to sit at their table? Because that's almost sometimes a more powerful way, or at least a more positive way of putting it. Like, I mean, as you make policy, as you go forward, are there union people there? Is there somebody from the Consumer Financial Protection Board there? Are those people involved in a process of setting policy? That matters. That matters almost as Elizabeth Warren said, and many others have said as well, that personnel is policy. Who's sitting down with Donald Trump when he makes these decisions? And the answer for Trump is no one we like. No one in any circumstance.
The worst people in America.
The worst people in America are sitting there doing it. That's so.
Al Franken, you think he's going to make it through? What do you think? What do you think should happen?
I think he should resign. I mean, especially the stakes are so low. I mean, because they have a Democratic governor, they would just replace him with another Democrat, and so they're not going to lose a vote in the Senate. Like the stuff they stand to gain a lot more. First of all, if they're going to stand on any sort of principle, they should probably just, And the thing is, it's not like they're throwing the balance of the Senate off or anything like that. Like the stakes are just way lower.
It is. Yeah, I largely agree with you.
What if I like Al Franken's comedy?
It is.
It's like we can get into like a philosophical debate. Can you separate the art from the man?
Right.
But are you allowed to like a Woody Allen movie?
It will give us the moral high ground.
Yeah.
But I already think we have it. It's frustrating that Al Franken will resign, and then Roy Moore will get elected to the Senate. There won't be an investigation. They won't not seat him. They'll seat him, and he'll be a United States Senator. And then in 3 years, he'll win again. This time with the proper Alabama Republican figure of 72% of the vote.
Right. And if Doug Jones wins, he'll live out the remainder of the term.
It's 3 years. It's 3 years. It's not nothing. It's not nothing. He'll be there until January of 2021. So it's not nothing. But yeah,
and then he'll go back to business as usual.
Although you never know. Maybe he's able to sort of establish himself as a good old boy who's liked. Who knows? Unlikely. I suspect that Doug Jones. But my hunch is that
the treasurer of Alabama is a Democrat.
It is just frustrating in a sense that if Al Franken, and again I got it, he should probably resign. But his sins on the list of people,
they don't compare.
His sins don't compare to, he's at the low end of a spectrum, but we're not allowed to have a spectrum because as soon as you have a spectrum, it seems like you're sort of dismissing. You don't want to be anywhere on the spectrum.
I think also the other problem with Al Franken is that there might be more coming out.
Well, that's the thing.
And he seems to
almost suggest that there might be. So that's the thing is that the worst thing to do is to have it little by little. Oh, you've survived it. Okay, survived one. She wrote a nice apology letter. Leanne Tweeden forgave him. Then it was one more, and then there are two. Now, again, you can't slow bleed it. If there are 3 more next weekend, then you're just going to have to go.
If you like this video, bless your heart. We got a lot more where that came from. We do a full show every day, Monday through Friday. Come enjoy it ad-free by becoming a member. tytnetwork.com/join.